Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. In this episode, Lance Izumi, Senior Director of PRI Center for Education, and Tim Anaya, Director of Communications, had a conversation with Rebecca Friedrichs. Her case, Friedrichs versus the California Teachers Association, was the original Supreme Court case that challenged the mandatory payment of union dues by non-union teachers. With the death of Justice Scalia, the case ended in a tie. A new case, Janus versus the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, was brought to the Supreme Court earlier this year and ended in victory for non-union members. These days, Rebecca hasn't given up the fight because even though non-union members no longer have to pay union dues, teachers still feel trapped in their unions and are unable to speak out against school district practices they disagree with. When it comes to First Amendment rights of teachers and other government employees, there's a lot more work to be done. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to Next Round with PRI, Rebecca.
Hey, thanks. It's wonderful to be here.
So most people know you as Janus before Janus. You were the plaintiff in a landmark lawsuit challenging the government forcing teachers to fund unions and causes they disagree with. Your case ultimately resulted in a 4-4 tie in the Supreme Court following the untimely death of Justice Antonin Scalia. Let's start at the beginning. What did you experience as a young teacher in the classroom that eventually led you to seek legal action against forced union dues?
Well, my story starts when I was a student teacher. I was only 22 years old, serving under an incredible master teacher who really was a gift to her students and to our schools. But next door to us was a teacher that, in my opinion, was abusive to her students. I would watch every single day as she would be lining them up after recess, and she would grab them, yank them. She'd get right into their little faces and scream at them. She mostly picked on the wiggly little boys who, they didn't have control over their wiggly little bodies. These children were 6 years old. They came up to her waist, and she towered over them. And so I went to my master teacher and I said, hey, I'm learning about being a mandated reporter of child abuse, and I think I see some child abuse next door, and it's the teacher. And that was the day my master teacher sat me down and said, Rebecca, today is the day you learn about teachers' unions and teacher tenure. And she also explained to me that the unions were taking teacher money and spending it on a political agenda that she and other teachers were really offended by. And so then my first few years of teaching, I dared to believe in school choice and to stand up in favor of vouchers. And that same union that allowed that woman to abuse the children called me a radical right-winger and bullied me and isolated me for daring to want what was best for the children.
It's often the case, and as you mentioned, that teachers who challenge the union face bullying and intimidation tactics when standing up to the status quo. So tell me specifically, what kind of backlash did you experience when you decided to take on the teachers union and go to court?
Yeah, it's so interesting, Lance, because my husband and my sons and I, we thought it was going to be all negative. We thought the attacks were going to be constant. But what really happened was the more I got out there, the more my face was out there and I was speaking the truth, the less the attacks were. Now, there were a lot of nasty words from the unions and the status quo. I mean, they labeled me the spawn of Satan, the pawn of the wealthy 1%, all these horrible name calling, unfortunately, that they do to anyone who dares to question their agenda. But teachers started thanking me in secret. They were too afraid to support me openly, and a few were mean to me. I admit that a few of those who really believed the union activism were mean. But most teachers would take me into a quiet spot, usually a darkened room where no one else was around, and they'd look and say, literally, they would say, are there any cameras in this room? And then they would hug me or say, thank you, I stand behind you, I'm praying for you. They were really grateful that I was standing up for them. So it ended up to be a very positive experience.
So you write about your experiences in your upcoming book, Standing Up to Goliath, which I'm looking forward to reading, and I know our listeners who are interested in your book, they can go to Amazon.com now and pre-order your book, or order your book, depending on when you listen to this. In your book, you talk about your experiences and your Supreme Court case. So give us a little insight into what it was like to take a case all the way to the Supreme Court court and what you felt when your case ended up in a tie.
Getting the honor of being the lead plaintiff in a case that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court was overwhelming. There are no words for it. I just can't believe that I was allowed to represent good and loving teachers all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Being in the court the day of oral arguments, the only way I can describe it is an out-of-body experience. To be sitting there and have the justices speaking about me, case Friedrichs versus California Teachers Association, was just overwhelming, but also wonderful. When we found out that Justice Scalia died, we were absolutely devastated. And then when we received our 4-4 tie, we just couldn't believe it. But I have to say that my husband and I, our family, even though we went through that devastating setback, we had a lot of peace, because we knew that we had been called to take this case and to stand up for teachers and children. And we knew that God just had a different plan. We didn't understand it, but he had a different plan. And so we just kept moving forward. And that's why I wrote my book, because I knew it was time to get the stories of real teachers who have been abused by unions out to the public. So that book is loaded with dozens of stories of teachers and parents and even children abused by the unions. And I'm just thrilled that anyone would read our stories and would help us to break free from this really damaging organization, the state and national teachers unions.
Well, I know that for my part, Rebecca, I really can't wait to read your book, Standing Up to Goliath, because it's a great story, and also, too, I can't wait to read about all the other experiences of other teachers who have gone through similar types of issues with the unions. So the issue of forced union dues isn't just about unions using your money to fund liberal candidates and causes that you may disagree with. Now, as I wrote in my own book, The Corrupt Classroom, the unions are also using your union dues to advocate for policies that have created bias and indoctrination in our classrooms. So maybe if you could talk about some of these policies and how they're negatively impacting public education in California.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that. And I'd also love to say, Lance, I read your book, The Corrupt Classroom. It's outstanding. And, in there you share some stories, too, of these awful policies. So I'm just going to highlight a couple. In California right now, the one we're fighting the hardest is the sex ed. I call it SEXXX ed because it really is totally inappropriate for children, the topics that they're covering in the sex ed curriculum. Thanks to the state and national teachers unions and their allies, we now have something called the California Healthy Youth Act. The trouble is there's nothing healthy about it. As a result of that new law, it became law January 1st, 2016, there are now only 6 approved curriculums, and it is requiring that teachers instruct the children on how and where to obtain birth control, including abortion, without parental knowledge or parental consent from age 12. These are little children, and teachers are being told that they have to instruct the children in these and many other offensive and actually medically dangerous practices. And so, unfortunately, it's the state and national teachers unions who have pushed all these things into our schools. And when teachers like myself speak out against them, or when parents speak out to protect their children, we're all bullied. I'm literally bullied. We were at Orange County Board of Education last week, and people were there bullying us for daring to speak out in protection of childhood innocence and childhood health. So that's just one of hundreds of policy issues brought by the teachers unions that are damaging to our kids in our schools.
Rebecca, in your long court battle and in your book, you've had the opportunity to talk with other teachers who have had similar experiences to your own. Could you share with us an anecdote or two of what other teachers told you when they were facing both in the classroom and battling union bullying tactics?
Yeah, sure, Tim. I could go on for a couple of weeks with stories, but I will highlight one. And this story is the story of a teacher named Kelly, and Kelly is highlighted in my book. She was a leader in her local union for 10 solid years, and she stepped up and even served as the local union president. And just so your listeners understand, most teachers, thousands of teachers across the country have told me this themselves. They love their local union because the local union is just their teacher colleagues standing up for each other. Our schools have gotten so corrupted that they feel that they need this united front. So they like their local, but they totally resent the state and national unions because those unions take 70, 80, 90, sometimes 100% of the dues and spend most of it on pushing far left political agenda and policies that are harmful to our kids. So as the union president, she saw how much money was going up to the state and national level. And when her teachers needed support, the state and national level would do nothing for them. They had no representation. The public is told that we're represented by these unions, but we're not. They really just use us to fund their agenda. So Kelly complained. She sent a letter to the state level and she let them know that they weren't getting good and proper services, that teachers were being harassed by administrators and were getting no support. And the response she received from her state union shocked her. They told her that her local association was on a warning system now because they weren't collecting enough money for the state and national union political action committee. So they were punished for actually asking for the services for which they were paying thousands and thousands of dollars. So she and her local leaders tried to break free from the state and national union. They wanted to do a decertification effort, which teachers are permitted to do. They just need to stand together. Well, when they tried to do that, the state and national union came in. They completely destroyed her efforts by turning teachers against her, lying to teachers about her and her team. They took over her offices. The state and national union kicked her and her local officers out of their positions. No vote, nothing, just kicked them out, took over their offices, changed the locks on their doors, took over their bank account. It was unbelievable. And your listeners will have to read the book to hear the rest of the story, but what I want them to know is that Kelly told me that the efforts to smear her and her teacher colleague, the effort to put their name out there and call them names and just this huge, expensive campaign against them was the worst thing that ever happened to her in her entire life. She told me there's not a day that goes by that she doesn't think about that awful circumstance.
I mean, we go from, something really terrible, like what happened to Kelly, to something better, where earlier this year we celebrated a great victory when Mark Janus prevailed in his challenge to force union dues. What are your thoughts now that we have finally achieved this long overdue victory in the Supreme Court as a follow-up to your case?
I'm so excited about that. On behalf of teachers like Kelly, I'm so excited about that because we finally have a voice. We can finally, opt out of these unions and pay them nothing. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the Janus case. First of all, Mark Janus and I like to joke around that, our case, everyone knew we were going to win, and then Justice Scalia died. So I always tell people I fumbled the ball on the 1 yard line. But Mark Janus came in, he recovered the fumble, and that guy ran it for a touchdown. We're just so excited about Mark's touchdown. And so what I would say to your listeners is toast Mark, celebrate Mark, thank Mark. Do that for one day and then get back to work. Because we have a lot of work to do. And Mark and I both would tell you, look, Mark's case, this win was the first domino to fall in a long, long, long battle to truly free teachers and other employees from the grip of angry and abusive unions. So we now have the right to opt out and pay them nothing, but people are still really, really terrified to opt out. So we have a lot of work to do. So please stay with us. The fight's not over.
Let's talk about a few more of these dominoes that need to fall, or maybe in California, it's more like new dominoes that are being put up. We had this great victory at the Supreme Court in June, yet union allies were already working overtime in Sacramento and in other union-friendly state capitals to try and blunt the impact of the Janus decision. So what are some of these new battles that we can expect in the coming months and years, and what can our listeners do to help you and the cause prevail over them?
Now, I am so glad you asked this question because the unions have made it very clear what's coming next. In Janus oral arguments, at the very end of the arguments, the last thing the union lawyer said was he basically made a threat, and he told the justices, look, if you let Janus win, the problem is that all these dues that everyone's forced to pay, or these fees that they're forced to pay, these are used so that we won't strike. If we're not not going to get these fees anymore, well, then we're going to strike all over the place. So he totally threatened them. So you've seen an uptick in teacher strikes. So the first thing I want your listeners to know is I don't know one single solitary teacher that wants to hold a picket sign. They all want to teach, and they're offended by strikes. And if you look at their faces, the unions put activists in the front of the strike, but if you look at the faces of the rest of the teachers, they're mortified. They don't want to be out there. They're embarrassed. So there are going to be more teacher strikes across the country, and I would ask people, make some picket signs and do a counter protest that says, I stand with the kids. I stand with loving teachers who don't want to be out here. I would love that if we saw counter-protest. The next thing the unions did, during my case, they had something here in California called the Friedrichs fix. They were going to fix it if my case won. Well, they continued pushing their fixes through the court, and they have been able to pass some of them and make them law. So now that Mark Janus has won, there are some new laws here in California and in many other states, particularly those that are dominated by Democrats, because Democrats are the ones who do the bidding of the state and national teachers unions. In the Friedrichs fix, they wanted to pass 3 laws. Number 1, they wanted unions to get 30 minutes with every employee on company time, on the taxpayer dime, to tell employees how great the union is. No one else gets invited to that meeting to tell them the other side. The unions were able to pass that law here in California. Number 2, they wanted to get updated home contact information on all people in union shop, regularly supplied to the unions. I think it's 4 times a year. No one else can get that information. They were able to pass that law too. So that is now happening. The third part was, if we won the Friedrichs case or the Janus case and people no longer were forced to pay dues, then the taxpayer has to pay the dues for them. So in other words, if Rebecca Friedrichs doesn't want to pay $1,200 a year to the teachers union, then the unions have to pay my $1,200 for me. In other words, the unions feel they're entitled to the money no matter what. They have not been able to make that a law yet, but you'll find out in my book that Justice Sotomayor actually talked about that from the bench. So they're trying to push these things. We need to beware. We need to fight back. I asked your listeners, I plead with your listeners, please adopt a teacher. If you would adopt any teacher you know and love, or adopt 5 or 10 of them, give them a copy of my book. My book explains to them everything that's going on, how their money's being spent, how much the unions take from them, what they do with it, how we're bullied. It explains it all, and it teaches them how to stand together. The unions have taught us to bully each other. Teachers need to stand together. It teaches us how to reunite and how to get these bullies out of our schools so that we can restore our schools and take care of our kids.
Well, Rebecca, I think that's a great warning for all of us that the fight does not stop, with these court cases. Again, I want to remind all our listeners that they need to go to Amazon, look up your book, Standing Up to Goliath, pre-order it. It's available for pre-order now. While they're there, they may also want to look up my book, The Corrupt Classroom.
Yes, definitely.
But in the aftermath of your court fight, you founded an organization called For Kids and Country to engage citizens to fight to restore our schools. So talk about your organization and some of the things that you're doing and how people can get involved and follow the work that you're doing.
Oh, that would be so great. Thank you for this opportunity. So For Kids and Country's goal, let me just tell you our mission. It is uniting, engaging, educating, and empowering parents, teachers, community members, and faith leaders in the fight to restore our schools and culture. So the unions have divided everyone. We aim to bring everyone back together for the good of kids, for the good of our schools and our culture. Currently, our biggest fight is the horrific sex ed. That sex ed is not just here in California, it's in multiple states. It has been being pushed through the United Nations for a couple of decades. It is impacting Canada, Australia, many countries in Africa. It's all over the place. And the state and national teachers unions are behind it with many other national organizations. So we're fighting that. How are we fighting it? By telling the truth about what's in these curriculums and how kids are being hurt. We're speaking up at school board meetings. We are posting videos online. We're telling our story. We're creating a documentary. We're doing everything we can to get the word out about the truth, that this sex ed is not some kind of attack on certain group. It's an attack on our children, and it's abusive. So we're fighting that. We're educating teachers on their rights to opt out of unions and or to stand together and decertify as a group. But mostly, as I said, we are working to bring healing where the state and national teachers unions have divided everyone. So that's our main goal. And I think you asked where people could follow us or get involved. We would love that. So we are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All they have to do is look up for Kids and Country. On Facebook and Twitter, it's the numeral 4 and then Kids and Country. On Instagram, it's FOR for Kids and Country. And then our website is FOR for kidsandcountry.org. And we would love to get more people involved in restoring our schools and our culture.
Finally, Rebecca, as is the tradition on every episode of Next Round, we always ask our guests to share their recommendations for a favorite wine or beer or cocktail or other beverage of their choice. I know you admonished us early to celebrate for one day, so we're celebrating today. So what are you drinking these days to toast our long overdue Supreme Court victory?
This is such a fun question. So if I were sitting with Mark Janus and you, Tim, and Lance, and my husband Charles, and a few of our wonderful warriors in this battle, and we were toasting the Janus win, I would probably order a Mai Tai. Unless we were at a Mexican restaurant, then I'd order a skinny margarita and a big old bowl of chips and a big thing of guacamole. That's how I would celebrate. But in my day-to-day, I'm really boring. My favorite drink is tea with almond milk, and I love drinking tea with Lance. So I guess I'm kind of a boring girl, but definitely celebrating every day.
Well, I think it's time to go get a margarita and that big bowl of chips. So with that, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim and Lance. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Rebecca. You're a warrior and you're our hero, so we really appreciate everything you do.
Oh, thank you, guys.
Thanks to our guests, Rebecca Friedrichs, and to Lance Azumi and to Tim Anaya. You'll find the work of PRI Center for Education on our website at pacificresearch.org. We'd also like to invite our listeners to PRI's annual Sir Anthony Fisher Gala in San Francisco on Saturday, November 10th. Our keynote speaker is none other than author and media commentator Mark Stein. For more details, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with Pacific Research Institute.